Hey guys, welcome to the world of sleep. Take a deep breath and gently close your eyes. Or don't. It doesn't matter. What matters is this. Somewhere in America, right now, someone is opening a freezer. The cold air spills out. That familiar rush, that faint electrical smell that every American freezer has had since roughly 1953. They reach in, pull something out, put it in the microwave or the oven, or sometimes they just stand there in the kitchen light, reading the instructions on the back of the box. They've done this 1,000 times. We all have. But no one, almost no one, ever stops to ask how this happened, how it became so ordinary, how the frozen meal in a tray moved from an impossible idea to the most normal thing in the world, as common as salt, as unremarkable as a chair. Tonight, we're going to ask. Slowly, without hurry. The way history is best understood, not as a list of dates and names and announcements, but as a series of quiet moments, small decisions made in factory offices, conversations at kitchen tables, a woman watching television while her dinner cooled, a man in Omaha staring at a problem that no one else thought was interesting. This is the story of how Americans stopped cooking dinner. Or rather, how they were offered a choice they didn't know they wanted, and how they took it, and how taking it changed everything. The year is 1953. Let's begin. The factory at the edge of the city. There is a city in Nebraska called Omaha. You may have passed through it on a map without stopping. It sits near the Missouri River, wide and flat, in the middle of the country, the kind of city that people sometimes call the heart of America, which is a phrase that sounds nice without meaning very much. It is not a glamorous city. It has never wanted to be. It has always been something more useful than glamorous, reliable, productive, organized around the business of feeding a nation that was still learning, in the early 1950s, how large and how hungry it was. In 1953, Omaha meant something specific in the American food industry. It meant meat. For decades, Omaha had been one of the great meat-packing centers of the United States. The history of this went back to the 1880s, when the first major stockyards were established near the Missouri River and the railroad lines converged to make the city a natural hub for the cattle and hog trade of the Great Plains. Cattle came in from the plains on trains that stretched for miles. Workers came in from everywhere else, from the farms of Iowa and Kansas, from the immigrant communities of Chicago and Milwaukee, from the rural South, following the rumor of work that paid steadily and kept you through the winter. The stockyards filled and emptied in a rhythm that the whole city learned to live around, the way people in coastal towns learn to live around the tides. You didn't schedule important things on certain days. You knew which direction the wind was coming from before you planned your morning. The smell of the stockyards was part of the texture of the city. Not pleasant by any ordinary standard, and yet carrying with it a kind of honesty, an acknowledgement of where food actually comes from and what it actually requires. Omaha had an unsentimental relationship to the distance between the animal and the table, and this unsentimental quality informed everything about the food industry that grew up around it. The Swanson company had its roots in this world. It had started in the early decades of the 20th century as a butter and egg business. Simple, honest goods, the kind that farmers sold at market and housewives bought without consulting a label. A man named Carl Swanson had built it from that modest beginning into something larger, expanding into poultry processing as the post-war boom in consumer food products created demand for exactly the kind of reliable, cold-chain managed protein that his operation was positioned to provide. His sons had grown it further, building distribution networks that could move frozen and refrigerated food from the processing floor to the grocery store shelf across hundreds of miles of American landscape without losing the cold chain that kept everything safe and good. By the early 1950s, Swanson was a name that housewives in the eastern United States recognized. Not famous in the way that soup companies or cereal companies were famous, not the kind of brand you discussed at the dinner table or mentioned in a magazine article, but reliable. The kind of company whose trucks you saw on the highway and felt a quiet confidence about, the way you feel about a bridge that has stood for 50 years without drama. It doesn't excite you, it doesn't need to. You trust it with your weight, and that is enough. The factory itself was not beautiful. Most factories aren't, and there is no reason they should be. This one sat at the edge of the city, long and low, built with the functional severity of mid-century American industrial architecture. No curves, no ornament, no concession to anything beyond the efficient movement of product from input to output. Surrounded by the particular flatness of the Midwest, with no hills to break the horizon and no trees old enough or large enough to soften the lines of the building, it sat in its landscape with complete self-possession. It made no apology for what it was. It was a factory. It made things. In winter, the steam from the processing equipment rose into a sky that was already the color of old aluminum, a flat, cold gray that seemed to begin at the roofline and extend upward without limit. The steam rose and dispersed and was gone, and more rose to replace it, an endless slow exhalation that you could see from the highway in January and December, that white breath marking the place on the flat horizon where the factory was before you could see the building itself. Truck drivers who ran the route knew to watch for it. In summer, the heat sat on the flat roof and didn't move. The workers came and went through heavy insulated doors that separated the refrigerated interior from the Midwestern summer outside. The doors opened with a rush of cold air that hit you in the face as you entered, a total environmental shift from the heat and light of the outside world to the cold and fluorescent brightness of the inside. Inside, it was always cold. The cold was the point. Everything that happened inside that factory happened in service of the cold that stopped time, that arrested the processes of decay, that preserved the integrity of the product through the long journey from processing floor to frozen case to dinner table. Workers in thick coats moved along the lines. They wore gloves and caps and sometimes scarves. Their breath was visible, small personal clouds that rose and dispersed like miniature versions of the factory's steam outside. The hiss of refrigeration was constant. You stopped hearing it after a few days on the job, the way you stop hearing the sound of your own heartbeat, but it was always there, always present, the background note of the entire operation. The sound of machinery that had no particular name. It simply processed. It moved things from one state to another. It transformed the raw into the ready. Chickens came in. Turkeys came in. They went out as something else, something portioned, packaged, labeled, frozen, stacked on pallets, loaded onto refrigerated trucks that idled in the loading dock with their own steady mechanical breath, waiting to carry the cold products out into the warm world. This is where our story begins. Not with a great idea, not with a visionary moment of inspiration announced to a room full of attentive listeners, but with a factory, a cold room, a problem, and a very great deal of turkey. The year is 1953. Thanksgiving has just ended, and something has gone very, very wrong at the Swanson Company in Omaha, Nebraska. 260 tons of turkey. Here is the problem, stated plainly. Swanson had ordered too many turkeys. This sounds simple, the kind of modest operational mistake that any company might make, the kind of error that gets discussed at a review meeting and noted for future planning and then filed away. But stand in the shoes of the men who managed that company in November of 1953, and the simplicity fades quickly. These were not careless businessmen. They were experienced, careful, knowledgeable people who understood the turkey market with the depth that comes from years of working inside it. They had ordered the turkeys they expected to sell based on the best available information, the best available projections, the best models they had for how much turkey American families would buy in the weeks leading up to Thanksgiving. The market had simply not cooperated. 260 tons. That is how much unsold frozen turkey Swanson found itself holding after Thanksgiving came and went in November of 1953. 260 tons of turkey sitting in refrigerated railroad cars, 10 railroad cars to be exact, rolling slowly back and forth across the country because there was nowhere to put them and no one was prepared to buy them at a price that made any commercial sense. Let us stay with that number for a moment, because it is worth understanding in concrete terms. A single ton is 2,000 pounds. 260 tons is 520,000 pounds of frozen turkey. That is enough turkey to give every man, woman, and child in Omaha approximately 1 pound each. It is enough turkey to fill a substantial warehouse several times over. It is, by any reasonable measure, an extraordinary amount of turkey to be managing in a period when the holiday season was over and no one in America was thinking about turkey in any particular way. The railroad cars kept moving because refrigerated railroad cars were not designed to sit still. When stationary, they used fuel less efficiently to maintain their internal temperature. When moving, the refrigeration system worked better. And so the turkey rolled. It crossed state lines. It passed through cities whose residents, going about their ordinary business on ordinary late November days, had no idea that 10 rail cars of frozen turkey were passing through on their way to nowhere in particular. The turkey crossed the Mississippi. It passed through the flat middle of the country. It went nowhere useful. It simply moved, burning money with every mile in the form of refrigeration costs and railroad fees and the salaries of the people who were trying to manage the situation. Turkey, you see, was a seasonal food in 1953. This was not a preference or a trend or something that advertising could easily change. It was a cultural conviction, deep and settled, that turkey was for Thanksgiving and possibly Christmas and was not for any other time of year. Turkey was not March. Turkey was not June. Turkey was not what you bought on a Wednesday evening in the middle of January thinking about what to make for dinner. The idea of selling turkey in any month other than the holiday window was, to most grocery store buyers and food industry executives of that era, so impractical as to be nearly unthinkable. Not worth exploring, not worth a serious conversation. This was the wall that the Swanson Company faced. The turkey was perishable, even frozen. Storage indefinitely was not possible. The refrigeration costs were mounting with every day. The value of the product was declining with every week that moved it further from the holiday season when it might have been sold at full price. The options were limited. Sell it below cost to institutions that bought food in large quantities, or absorb the loss and learn from the experience, or find some other solution that no one had thought of yet. Into this situation came Gerry Thomas, who was at that time a salesman for the company and not yet, in any official sense, the person responsible for solving the turkey problem. He had been on a recent business trip that had taken him at some point on an airplane. And on that airplane, as the clouds moved past the oval window and the engines held their steady note, he had eaten a meal from a compartmented aluminum tray. The meal was airline food, which is to say it was not memorable, not particularly good, not the kind of thing you thought about afterward. The food was what it was. But the tray had stayed with him. 3 sections, everything in its place. Hot, complete, organized. A meal without a kitchen. A meal that had traveled. A meal that had been made somewhere else a long time ago and had arrived here at his tray table, still warm and still recognizably dinner. He looked at the turkey in the railroad cars. He looked at the airplane tray in his memory. And a connection formed that was simple, obvious in retrospect, and had somehow not occurred to anyone before this moment. What if you put the turkey in a tray like that? Gerry Thomas, Gerry to everyone who worked with him, was not what you would call an obvious visionary. He was a salesman, 30 years old in 1953. A Midwesterner with the particular combination of practicality and optimism that the Midwest often produces. The conviction that problems are meant to be solved, that solutions are available to anyone willing to look for them without too much self-importance about the looking, that the difference between a good idea and a bad one is usually whether it actually works. He had grown up during the Depression and the war, which meant he had grown up understanding scarcity and the value of things that other people overlooked. His family was not wealthy, and he had absorbed, in the way that children absorb the financial texture of their households, the particular intelligence of people who make things stretch. The roast that lasts 3 days, the shoes that get resold twice before they're replaced, the sensibility that finds value in what others discard. This is the education that economic necessity provides, and it is, in its way, more thorough than any curriculum. He had come to Swanson through the ordinary route of a mid-century American career, an entry-level job that suited his temperament, followed by positions that used his skills more fully, followed eventually by a role in sales that fit him the way good work fits a person who has found their right category. He was good at selling because he was good at listening, at hearing what people said they wanted and also what they meant, at identifying the need beneath the expressed preference, at understanding that most purchases are driven less by reason than by feeling, and that the salesman's job is to make the feeling legitimate and the reason plausible. In the fall of 1953, Thomas had been traveling on company business when he found himself on an airplane, not an unusual mode of transport for a salesman who covered large territories, but still somewhat novel as a routine experience, still carrying with it a slight residue of the exotic that air travel would eventually shed entirely as the decades passed. On one of these flights, he ate a meal from a compartmented aluminum tray. The meal was ordinary, but the organization of it caught his attention in the specific way that only practically minded people notice things, not as an aesthetic object, not as a design achievement, but as a problem solution. Someone had figured out how to serve a complete meal in a container that maintained the separation of components, that could be heated and handled and eaten with reasonable efficiency, that required nothing of the eater except a fork. He brought the idea back to Swanson not as a fully formed proposal, but as a question. Could they do this with the turkey? Could they portion the meat, add a starch and a vegetable, seal everything in a compartmented aluminum tray, freeze it, and sell it to housewives as a complete frozen dinner? The packaging would be key. It would need to communicate what the product was and make the housewife comfortable with the idea of heating a frozen tray in her oven. The price would need to be accessible. The quality would need to be consistent enough to justify repeat purchases. He took the idea to his superiors. The reception was cool. The men in those rooms were experienced in the food industry, and the experience of the food industry in 1953 said that selling complete frozen meals to American housewives was not a natural market, that the resistance to frozen food as a replacement for home cooking was deep and cultural and not easily overcome by pricing or packaging. Women cooked because cooking was care. That was the equation. You couldn't simply offer a tray from a freezer and expect it to substitute for the equation. Thomas listened to these objections and found in each of them an answer. The tray was not a replacement for cooking, he said. It was an addition to the cook's options, not instead of the family meal, but alongside it, for the evenings when cooking was genuinely not possible, when the choice was between the frozen tray and something worse. He was not proposing to change how Americans thought about food. He was proposing to give American housewives one more tool in a toolkit that was already full of tools designed to make domestic life more manageable. He was persistent in the specific way that makes persistence effective. Not aggressive, not confrontational, but steady. Each time an objection was raised, he found an answer. Each time the conversation stalled, he came back to it from a different direction. He refined the numbers. He identified the grocery buyers who might be most receptive. He constructed the argument that acknowledged the cultural weight of the cooking objection and then moved carefully around it, not through it. Eventually, Swanson agreed to try it. A small run, cautious, just to see what happened. They would make 5,000 units. They would price them at 98 cents. They would put them in grocery stores in selected markets and observe. If the product found no buyers, the experiment would be over. If it found buyers, they would learn something. They made 5,000 units. In the first year, they sold more than 10 million. The experiment did not end. It became instead the foundation of an industry. The tray that changed everything. Let us stop and look at the object itself. The tray. It was made of aluminum, the same light, strong, modern metal that was beginning to appear everywhere in post-war American life. Aluminum foil for wrapping leftovers, aluminum pots and pans, lighter than cast iron and easier to clean. Aluminum in the bodies of new automobiles, in the frames of the aircraft that were making air travel ordinary for the first time, in the construction of the new buildings rising in American cities. Aluminum was the metal of the future, or so the 1950s believed, and there was sufficient evidence for this belief to make it feel like certainty rather than aspiration. The tray caught the light differently than a ceramic plate. It was more reflective, a cool, slightly industrial brightness that sat somewhere between the warmth of pottery and the pure utility of sheet metal. When it came out of the oven, it held that brightness along with the heat of the food, and the steam that rose from the warm compartments came from a source that was both domestic and somehow slightly scientific, suggesting the laboratory and the kitchen simultaneously, the modern and the familiar in the same object. The first Swanson TV dinner measured approximately 7 inches by 9.5. This is close to the proportions of a standard dinner plate, but rectangular, more efficient from a manufacturing perspective, easier to stack and store, better suited for the cardboard box that would contain it through its journey from factory to store to home. The shape was not designed for beauty. It was designed for function. And yet function, when it is this complete, has its own kind of beauty. The beauty of the thing that does exactly what it needs to do, without apology or excess. 3 compartments occupied the tray's surface. The largest, taking up roughly half the total area, held the main protein. The two smaller compartments, side by side in the remaining half, held the starch and the vegetable. The walls between the compartments were folded aluminum, perhaps a quarter-inch high, low enough that you could see the whole meal at once, high enough to keep each element in its designated territory through the freeze-thaw cycle and the 25 minutes in the oven. The engineering of those walls was more specific than it appeared. They had been tested, calibrated to maintain the structural integrity of the compartment system through the full range of temperatures the tray would experience. The first Swanson TV dinner contained a slice of turkey, pale and tender, cut from the breast and arranged across the largest compartment in the manner of a Thanksgiving plate. Not the whole experience of Thanksgiving, but its essential protein, its identifying element, the thing that said holiday and abundance and the gathering of family, even when the gathering was a single person on a Tuesday evening in February. Cornbread dressing in the adjacent compartment, dense, slightly sweet, the kind of stuffing that holds its texture through freezing and reheating, that releases its herb and fat flavors slowly as it warms, that tastes like the side dish it was designed to complement. Buttered peas in one of the smaller compartments, small, bright green, sometimes soft after the reheating process, but reliably hot and simply seasoned. Sweet potatoes in the remaining section, slightly glazed, warm and orange and sweet against the savory elements that surrounded them. 4 components, 1 tray, 98 cents. Everything included. Nothing required except an oven set to 425 degrees and 25 minutes of waiting. The packaging that contained this tray was as important as the food inside. Swanson's designers created a box that was immediately, legibly, unmistakably of its moment. The front of the box showed a television set, a console television, large and domestic, the kind that was becoming the centerpiece of American living rooms in 1953. The television set was drawn in warm colors. It looked safe and modern and right. Inside the television screen on the box, framed by the television's rounded screen, as if this were a broadcast, they showed the meal, depicted in the warm, slightly idealized colors of 1950s food illustration, more vivid than the actual food, more perfectly arranged, more generously abundant. But the television set was the signal. It said, "This food belongs in the living room. This food belongs in front of the screen. This is not an ordinary dinner at the table. This is something new." They called it the TV dinner. 2 words, clean and modern and perfectly American. The name did not describe the food. It described where the food belonged and what it meant. Not a frozen turkey meal, not a quick dinner, the TV dinner. The dinner of the new age, the dinner of the screen and the evening, and the relaxed modern family that was, the advertisement implied, already living the life that the TV dinner was designed to serve. The name was one of the most successful pieces of product naming in American food history. It lasted. Decades after the specific product had changed, and the brand had changed, and the aluminum tray had been replaced by plastic, the term TV dinner remained in American vocabulary as a generic term for any frozen complete meal, regardless of brand or format or price. That is what a successful name does. It leaves the product behind and enters the language. It becomes a concept, a category, a way of saying a thing that people recognize even when the original referent is long gone. The boxes went into grocery store freezers in the fall of 1953. The cold cases opened. The boxes were stacked. The lights came on behind them. America walked past, slowed down, opened the door, reached in. The first bite. Imagine, if you can, the first time an ordinary American family ate one. Not the first person technically. Somewhere in the Swanson test kitchens in 1953, someone had eaten these things dozens of times before they ever reached a grocery store. Food scientists and quality testers had evaluated every aspect of the product through the clinical lens of production standards. The temperature at which it emerged from the oven, the consistency of each component through multiple freeze-thaw cycles, the way the flavors held or changed across the duration of intended shelf life. But let us imagine the first ordinary family, not a test, not a protocol, not a controlled environment. Just a family on an evening in the fall of 1953 in a house somewhere in the vast American middle, Ohio perhaps, or New Jersey, or California. Anywhere that suburban houses were being built and grocery stores were being opened and televisions were being purchased and ordinary American life was proceeding in its ordinary American way. The mother bought the box on a Tuesday at the grocery store. She was doing the week's shopping, the full circuit of the store, cart filling gradually with the week's necessities. She had passed the frozen food section before, many times, with varying degrees of attention. The frozen peas were something she bought occasionally. The frozen orange juice concentrate was becoming a habit, but the complete frozen meals, those she had looked at and passed by, not quite sure what to make of them, not quite sure they were for someone like her. On this particular Tuesday, she stopped. She opened the glass door of the freezer case and took out the box with the television set on the front. She turned it over. She read the back. Preheat oven to 425 degrees. Remove tray from outer box. Do not cover. Bake 25 minutes. She considered this for a moment. She put it in the cart. She continued shopping. She carried it home in a paper bag along with everything else, the bread and the milk and the canned soup and the cereal. The TV dinner box rode with the other groceries, slightly cold to the touch from its time in the case, its decorated surface facing upward in the bag. The television set, the perfect food inside it, the name in its confident modern lettering. She put it in the freezer when she got home and likely did not think about it again until the particular evening when it became the right answer to the question of what dinner would be. Perhaps it was the evening when she was more tired than usual, or the evening when her husband called to say he would be late and she was feeding the children alone, or simply an evening in early December when the day had been long and the kitchen felt like too much, and the 25-minute promise on the back of the box seemed, in that moment, like the most reasonable thing she had ever read. She took the box from the freezer, peeled away the outer cardboard. The aluminum tray was inside, sealed with a thin foil cover, cold and lighter than expected. Aluminum always lies about the weight of what it contains. She set the oven to 425 degrees and waited for it to preheat, which took several minutes in a 1953 oven. While she waited, she may have stood at the kitchen counter, or she may have gone to the living room where the children were watching television, or she may have simply sat down for the first time since morning. When the oven was ready, she put the tray in, set a timer, closed the oven door, and then she left the kitchen. This is the moment that mattered, not the eating, not the tasting, but this, the leaving. On every other evening, leaving the kitchen at the beginning of dinner preparation meant something had been forgotten or interrupted. The kitchen, when dinner was being made, required a presence. It required attention. It required the particular focused awareness of someone managing multiple things simultaneously. The pot that was close to boiling, the timer that needed watching, the components that needed to be combined at the right moment in the right sequence. There was nothing to manage now. The oven was managing it. The tray was sealed. The meal was already made. It was simply being warmed to the temperature at which it could be eaten. She was free for 25 minutes from the kitchen in a way that felt, even though she would not have used this word, like a small, real, practical permission to not be the person making dinner for 25 minutes. After 25 minutes, the smell in the kitchen was warm and savory. turkey and cornbread, the smell of a holiday condensed into a Tuesday. She took the tray out with oven mitts. It was hot in the way that aluminum is hot, immediately, conductively, going through the mitts. She carried it to the table, or to the coffee table in the living room, or wherever her family ate on evenings when the decision had already been made. She set it down. They looked at it. 3 sections, steam rising from each. The turkey pale and soft in the largest compartment, the dressing alongside it, the peas in their corner, the sweet potatoes glazed and orange. Someone, one of the children, asked what it was. "A TV dinner," she said. They ate. The turkey was soft, the dressing was warm and held together. The peas were fine, perhaps slightly soft from the reheating. The sweet potatoes were good. The glaze had survived the process intact. It was not the best meal she had ever made. She was too good a cook not to know that. But it was warm and it was complete, and she had sat down before the food was ready. For 25 minutes, she had simply waited. And the waiting, in the middle of the week, felt like a gift she hadn't known to ask for. To understand why 10 million TV dinners sold in the first year, why a product no one had asked for found its way into American freezers with such remarkable speed, you have to understand something about American women in 1953. And that understanding begins, necessarily, several years earlier. The war had ended in 1945, 8 years before. In the 4 years of American involvement in the Second World War, the domestic landscape had shifted in ways that were both enormously visible and inadequately discussed. Millions of American men had left for the armed forces, the young men, the working men, the men who had been running the factories and the farms and the offices that kept the economy moving. The industrial economy had expanded at a pace the pre-war period could not have predicted. The factories that had been making cars and refrigerators and radios now made tanks and aircraft and munitions. They needed workers. The workers available were, in very large numbers, women. Between 1941 and 1945, the number of women working outside the home in the United States increased by several million. Women managed offices, ran departments, operated heavy machinery, oversaw production lines. They did work that the pre-war consensus had assumed they could not do, or should not do, or would not do well. And they did it competently, often brilliantly, sometimes with a skill and efficiency that exceeded what the men they had replaced had brought to the same jobs. Rosie the Riveter was not a fiction. It was a compression of several million true stories, each one a woman who had discovered in the specific circumstances of wartime necessity that she was capable of more than she had been told. Then the war ended. The men came home. And the expectation, enormous, unstated, culturally enforced in 1,000 ways simultaneously, was that the women would return. Return to the home, return to the kitchen, return to the role that had been waiting for them, preserved and intact, like something put in cold storage against their eventual homecoming. The role was still there. The culture insisted it had always been their natural place. Everything could go back to how it had been before. Many women did return, and many returned genuinely and with some measure of relief, to children who needed them, to households that had been difficult to manage from a distance, to the rhythms of domestic life that had their own satisfactions and their own legitimate pleasures. The post-war suburb, with its new houses and its new appliances and its communities of families at similar life stages, offered real things: space, order, a kind of stability that the Depression and the war had made feel precious. Many women built good lives within its structures and found those lives genuinely fulfilling. But many women returned carrying something alongside the gladness: a memory. The memory of having been useful in a different way, in a way that had been recognized and compensated and taken seriously. The memory of having had a place in the world that was visible, that was counted, that existed outside the walls of the home. This memory was not spoken aloud, The culture of the early 1950s was not organized to receive it, to validate it, to acknowledge that a woman might feel its absence as a loss. The advertising and the magazine articles and the television programs and the popular wisdom all moved in the opposite direction. All insisted that the domestic life was the natural life, the fulfilling life, the life that a woman of good sense would choose. Underneath this surface, the feelings were there. The tiredness was there. The isolation of the suburb, where each house was separate from each other house, where the days were long and the adult company was limited, and the television had not yet fully replaced the social life that dense neighborhood living had provided, was there. The particular claustrophobic quality that sometimes descended on a Tuesday afternoon in November, when the children were at school and the husband was at work and the house was clean and there was nothing to do except prepare for the next round of the same tasks. This was there, in many women, many afternoons in the 1950s. And here came a small aluminum tray, priced at 98 cents, with a television set on the box. It did not promise liberation. It was careful not to. It was advertised with precise deliberateness as a convenience, a tool for the busy evening, an option for the tired night, a resource for the practical woman who knew how to manage her household intelligently. It did not challenge the equation of cooking and love. It simply offered for one evening a way around the equation's most labor-intensive term. American women heard something underneath the modest language. They heard the possibility of one evening in which dinner did not require them to stand at a stove for an hour. One evening in which the meal required nothing of them except 25 minutes and an oven and the small decision to take the box from the freezer. One evening in which they could sit down. 10 million units in the first year. 100,000 women sitting down on evenings that had previously kept them standing. That is what 10 million TV dinners looked like from the inside. The television in the corner. In 1950, approximately 9% of American homes contained a television set. In 1960, that number was nearly 90%. In one decade, a technology moved from the possession of roughly 1 in 11 American families to nearly 9 in 10. No technology in American history had spread through the population with this velocity. Not the telephone, which took decades to approach full penetration. Not the automobile, which spread more slowly even in its most explosive period of growth. The television was, in the sociological sense, something new, a technology that moved from novelty to necessity faster than any previous technology had moved, faster than the culture had fully prepared for. This rapid adoption was not simply a matter of the television's entertainment value, though that value was real and significant. It was also a matter of what the television offered culturally. Access to a shared conversation. American life in the early 1950s was geographically dispersed, particularly in the suburbs that were absorbing so much of the country's population growth. People who had moved from cities to suburbs, from one region to another, from the familiar communities of their childhoods to the new developments of the post-war boom, found themselves in places where the common culture was still being established. The television gave them common references, the same shows, the same stars, the same events watched simultaneously by millions of people who had nothing else in common. It created the shared cultural material from which community could be constructed. The television changed the shape of American homes, not metaphorically, physically. Interior designers and architects writing in professional publications in the early 1950s were already analyzing the challenge and opportunity of the television set in the living room. Before the television, living rooms had been organized around conversation, chairs facing inward, furniture arranged to facilitate the exchange of words and attention between the people present. The rooms said, "Face each other." The television disrupted this arrangement with the authority of a new necessity. It required a focal point, a place where every seat had an unobstructed view of the screen. The furniture rotated, chairs turned, sofas repositioned, lamps moved to reduce glare. The room reorganized itself around the new object the way rooms have always reorganized themselves around the things that matter most to the people who inhabit them. The way medieval halls organized themselves around the fire, the way Victorian parlors organized themselves around the piano. The television was the new center of gravity. This is the relevant fact. The television became, in American homes, the equivalent of the hearth, the source of warmth, in this case, warmth of the emotional and social variety, the warmth of shared entertainment and shared laughter, and the specific pleasure of watching something together, the place where the household gathered at the end of the day. And the hearth, in every culture, in every era of human history, is where people eat. Families were beginning to eat in front of the television by the early 1950s. Not every family, not every evening, but the practice was spreading, visible enough that furniture manufacturers were already producing TV trays, those low folding tables with detachable legs designed specifically for eating in front of the screen. The TV tray is itself a remarkable cultural artifact, a piece of furniture whose entire design encodes a single assumption about how American domestic life would be organized. The legs fold flat for storage under a couch. The surface is at the right height for eating from a sofa. Everything about the object says the meal has moved. The table is in front of the television now. The television programming of the early 1950s had a quality that is nearly impossible to replicate in the present. It was appointment television in the absolute sense. No recording technology existed for home consumers. No pause, no rewind, no streaming, no catch-up. If your program was on at 8 on Tuesday evening, you watched it at 8 on Tuesday evening, or you did not watch it. The show did not wait for you. You waited for the show. This created a new kind of household calendar, organized not around work and family obligations, but around the television schedule. Ed Sullivan was Sunday at 8. I Love Lucy was Monday at 9. The Jack Benny program, Milton Berle, Your Show of Shows, each at its appointed hour, each claiming its portion of the week with the regularity of a scheduled appointment. American families arranged their evenings around these hours. Dinner happened before or during or after, depending on the show and the family. Into this world came the TV dinner, a meal designed to be eaten in front of the screen at the hour of the prime-time schedule without requiring anyone to leave the living room or miss the crucial scene. The synchronization of product and moment was, in retrospect, almost too perfect. The aluminum tray and the cathode ray tube found each other because both were expressions of the same underlying shift in how Americans thought about their evenings. The shift from the dinner table as the center of the family gathering to the television set as the center of the family gathering. They were made for each other by circumstances that no one had fully planned. Selling the dream. To sell a new kind of product, a product that requires consumers to change not just what they buy, but how they think about a daily ritual, you must sell an idea before you sell the object. The object comes second. The idea comes first. Swanson understood this, or at least the people who ran its marketing department understood it with the clarity that good advertising people bring to their work. The print advertisements that Swanson created for the TV dinner in the first years were, by the standards of the time, genuinely sophisticated. They did not simply describe the product or list its features or compare it favorably to alternatives. They described a life, a specific, modern, desirable American life that the product made possible, or rather, that the product was already part of in the world the advertisement created for 30 seconds in the mind of the reader. The images in these advertisements showed families, always the particular family of American post-war aspiration. A father, a mother, 2 or 3 children, all clean and smiling and arranged in a living room that was somehow both familiar and aspirational. New furniture, clean carpet, a room that had not been lived in hard. The family in these advertisements was not wealthy. They were not in a mansion, not surrounded by servants or obvious luxury, but they were comfortable in the specific American way, prosperous enough to have the new things, organized enough to maintain them, at ease enough to smile about it. The crucial detail in these advertisements was the location of the mother. She was in the living room, not the kitchen, the living room. She was sitting on the sofa, or leaning in a chair, or laughing at something on the television. Her posture communicated ease. Her expression communicated presence. She was here, with her family, in the part of the evening that followed the work of the day. The kitchen was absent from these images, physically absent, not shown, not referenced. The mother had been released from it, transported past the labor to the reward, and the advertisement showed the reward without asking you to think about what had made it possible. Television advertising came later, and it was, in its way, even more effective than print, because now the advertisement for the TV dinner appeared on the television set while you were watching the television, while you were perhaps eating a TV dinner, while the TV tray held the aluminum tray that held the meal the advertisement had sold you. The loop was complete and perfectly closed. The television recommended itself through the dinner. The dinner justified the television through its name. The advertisement lived inside the experience it was advertising. It was a commercial arrangement of almost perfect circularity. By 1955, the advertising had expanded along with the product line. Chicken TV dinners, beef TV dinners, fish TV dinners for Friday nights, each with its own slightly different promise, each aimed at a slightly different version of the same consumer. The variety itself became a selling point. The frozen meal was not a single option, but a menu, a range of choices, a response to the diversity of tastes and requirements within the American household. The freezer was becoming, the advertising implied, a kind of pantry, not a storage unit for 1 or 2 emergency meals, but a resource from which any evening could be managed. American consumers received this message and acted on it. The freezer case in the grocery store expanded to accommodate their response. The shelf space devoted to frozen complete meals grew. The number of brands and products grew. And with the growth of the market came the growth of the marketing, each brand spending more on advertising, each advertisement reaching more consumers, each message reinforcing the idea that the frozen meal was not a compromise, but a choice, and a reasonable, modern, American one. The suburban kitchen. The American suburb was still being built in 1953, and the speed of its construction was itself a form of history, not the slow history of organic growth that had shaped cities over centuries, but the fast history of deliberate production, of application of industrial logic to the problem of housing a nation that had survived a depression and a war and was ready now to live. William Levitt had shown what was possible. 17,000 houses on 1,100 acres of former Long Island farmland, built in 4 years by applying assembly line logic to construction. Each house built in the same sequence of steps, each component prefabricated and delivered to the site. Workers who specialized in one operation, one crew for foundations, one for framing, one for plumbing, one for roofing, moving from house to house rather than staying with one house for completion. The result was a city of 20,000 families built faster than any city had been built before, at a price that veterans and their young families could afford with the help of the GI Bill mortgages that made the down payment manageable. Levittown was not unique. It was the most famous example of a phenomenon spreading across the country, the planned suburb, the manufactured community, the deliberate construction of the American domestic dream at industrial scale. Near every major American city, developers were finding farmland and applying Levitt's logic or their own version of it, building thousands of houses in fields that had recently grown potatoes or corn or soybeans, creating communities where none had existed 6 months before. Each house in these suburbs occupied a specific position in the cultural imagination of the period. It was modern, it was American, it represented the achievement that was possible in the post-war world, the world that had come through the Depression and the war intact, that had not lost its capacity for optimism or its appetite for the things that prosperity could provide. The house with the 2 bedrooms, the yard, the attached garage. This house was not just shelter. It was proof that the American promise had not been a lie. And at the center of this house, in the cultural and practical sense, was the kitchen. The kitchen in the post-war suburban house was specifically designed to be modern. White appliances, the refrigerator with its separate freezer compartment, the gas or electric range with 4 burners and a full-sized oven, the sink with hot and cold running water and a window above it that looked into the backyard. Formica countertops in clean colors, turquoise, yellow, a pale green that the period found cheerful. Linoleum floors, easy to clean, cabinets with simple hardware, organized to minimize steps between the refrigerator and the stove and the sink, following the kitchen work triangle that domestic scientists had spent years refining. The kitchen was also, in the post-war suburb, a social space in ways that earlier kitchens had not been. The open floor plans of the new houses connected the kitchen to the living areas, making the person cooking in the kitchen a participant in the household's social life rather than an isolated laborer behind a closed door. Neighbors came in for coffee in the mid-morning. The kitchen was the room where the suburb's daytime social life happened, the conversations, the small community that women who lived on the same street built through daily proximity and shared circumstance. The well-equipped kitchen was a statement. It said something about the household's participation in the American project of post-war prosperity. The refrigerator, the stove, the mixer, the toaster, these were consumer goods that marked you as a member of the middle class, as a family that had achieved something, as people living in the right moment in the right country and doing it correctly. The kitchen was on display, and being on display meant that it needed to look like what a modern kitchen was supposed to look like. Into this kitchen came the television-ready frozen meal in its decorated box. It went into the freezer compartment of the modern refrigerator alongside the things that were already there, the frozen peas and the frozen orange juice and the ice cream reserved for special occasions. It occupied perhaps 1 shelf, then 2, as the purchase of TV dinners became a weekly habit rather than an occasional experiment. The freezer that had been designed as a storage compartment for frozen vegetables and ice cream was becoming something else, a repository of complete meals, a collection of future dinners, a pantry organized around cold and time rather than warmth and immediacy.
The suburban housewife standing in front of the open freezer on a weekday evening, surveying her options, was living a version of domestic life that her own mother had not lived. She was a consumer of meals as well as a producer of them. She was a manager of a domestic system that included industrial production alongside her own labor. She was, in a small but real way, a different kind of cook than any previous generation had been.
Children loved the TV dinner. This is perhaps the least surprising fact in the entire story, and yet it is worth dwelling on because the specific reasons children loved it illuminate something important about what the product actually was, beneath the marketing and the economics and the cultural history. Children in the 1950s ate what their parents prepared. This was not negotiable, not a matter of preference or personality. The culture of the post-war American household was explicitly hierarchical in matters of food. Adults decided what was served, children ate it, and the idea that children's food preferences should be a significant factor in meal planning was considered by most parents and most child-rearing authorities to be a fundamental misunderstanding of the proper relationship between adults and children. The pediatrician Dr. Benjamin Spock was in the process of transforming American child-rearing philosophy in the 1950s, but even his more permissive approach did not extend to allowing children to dictate dinner. You ate what was set in front of you. You thanked whoever had made it. You asked to be excused when you were finished, not before. The TV dinner did not challenge this hierarchy. It arrived with all its components already chosen, already portioned, already arranged. The child did not select the meal, but it gave children something that the family dinner table rarely gave them, a meal that was wholly and specifically theirs. The tray was yours, not a portion of a shared dish, not the serving spoon passed down the table, not the casserole from which you took what you were given. The tray was designed for one person. It had been made for you, in the specific sense that the portion in front of you was not the result of someone else deciding how much you should have from a common supply. It was complete in itself. It was private, in the way that very few things in a child's life are truly private. And the compartments. The compartments were, to many children, one of the TV dinner's great and underappreciated virtues. The peas did not touch the turkey. The sweet potatoes could not contaminate the cornbread dressing. Each element remained in its designated territory, separated by the clean, low walls of pressed aluminum, maintaining its identity, not bleeding into its neighbors. This matters more to a 7-year-old than it matters to an adult. Any adult who has forgotten this has forgotten something important about childhood. The way small disorders can feel like large violations, the way the mixing of things that are supposed to be separate can produce a distress that seems disproportionate to an observer, but is entirely genuine to the person experiencing it. The food on the plate that is mixed itself, the gravy that is run into the vegetables, the juice from the meat that has soaked the bread, this is, to many children, not merely unappealing, but categorically wrong. Things should be what they are. They should stay where they belong. The TV dinner satisfied this need perfectly, and the food scientists who had designed the tray's compartment walls had not been thinking about childhood food anxiety at all. They had been thinking about flavor migration and structural integrity through the freeze-thaw cycle. The separation that children found psychologically comforting had been engineered for entirely practical reasons. The two purposes aligned, producing an object that was right for children in a way that no one had planned. And then there was the television. To eat in front of the television was, in most American families of the early 1950s, a treat, something reserved for special occasions, for nights when the show was important enough to justify moving dinner from the table to the living room, for evenings when the rules were relaxed as a gift. The TV dinner did not abolish this special quality immediately.
In the beginning, it probably maintained it. The TV dinner itself was special, a novelty, a departure from the ordinary, and eating it in front of the television preserved and amplified that specialness. Over time, as the TV dinner became routine, the routine acquired its own warmth, the ordinary pleasure of the regular thing, the Tuesday evening that proceeded in a known way, with the familiar tray and the familiar smell from the oven and the familiar programs on the screen. Ordinary pleasures when you are a child have a sweetness that extraordinary ones cannot always match. They are available, repeatable, reliable in the way that the extraordinary never is. For an entire generation of American children, the baby boomers born between 1946 and 1964, the TV dinner was part of the texture of childhood in the way that only daily objects can be. Not a single memory, but a type of memory, a background condition against which specific evenings and specific programs and specific dinners played out. The aluminum tray cooling on the coffee table, the steam rising from 3 compartments, the sound of the television filling the living room with voices and laughter, and the particular emotional weather of the programs of that era. These memories were not grand. They were not the memories that people tell as stories, not the memories of the extraordinary occasions that stand out from the texture of daily life. They were the texture itself. The grain of an ordinary American childhood, unremarkable in the moment, irreplaceable in retrospect. Competitors in the freezer aisle for long. Success in consumer products is its own advertisement. It signals to the rest of the industry that a market exists, that consumers are willing to pay, that the product category is real. When the food industry observed Swanson's first-year sales numbers, the response was swift, large, and entirely predictable. Every company that had the capability to enter the frozen complete meal market began moving to do so. The companies that moved first were those with existing infrastructure in frozen food production, processing facilities, cold chain logistics, distribution networks, relationships with the grocery buyers who managed the frozen food sections of America's expanding supermarkets. They had most of what they needed to compete. They simply needed to redirect capacity toward the new category and develop products that could hold their own against the Swanson original. What these competitors accomplished collectively was more significant than what any of them accomplished individually. Each new brand in the frozen meal category validated the concept. Each new product that a consumer tried and liked, or even tried and found acceptable, made them more comfortable with the category as a whole, more willing to try the next one, more likely to return to the frozen food case on the next shopping trip. The market was not a fixed size that competitors were dividing among themselves. It was a market that was growing continuously and rapidly because the presence of more products made the category more legitimate, and the legitimacy attracted more consumers. The grocery store responded to this growth in ways that were visible and cumulative. The frozen food section expanded year by year throughout the late 1950s. New supermarkets being designed in this period included larger frozen food sections than any previous generation of store design had allocated. Existing stores renovated to add more freezer cases, moved the frozen food section to a more prominent location, invested in the better lighting and the cleaner presentation that helped consumers see and select from the growing range of products. By 1960, the frozen food section of a well-stocked American supermarket was a significant commercial space, not an afterthought, but a destination. What was lost? Here we should pause. The story of the TV dinner is, in many ways, a success story, of ingenuity applied to a problem, of a product finding its audience, of an industry growing and diversifying and serving genuine consumer needs. These things are real and worth acknowledging. But success always costs something, and the cost of this success was paid not in money,
but in the quieter currency of things that changed so gradually that no one noticed them changing until they were already gone. The family dinner table. Not the physical object, the table remained in the dining rooms and kitchens of American houses, remained available for the holidays and the Sundays and the special occasions that still warranted its formal use. But the daily table, the ordinary weekday dinner that happened not because anyone had decided it was special, but simply because people needed to eat and families had always eaten together and the table was where you ate. The daily dinner table had required, for its existence, a meal that was made. And making a meal, even the simplest weeknight meal, even the most modest practical dinner that made no pretension to artistry, requires time. Not much time, perhaps, but specific time. Time spent in the kitchen, engaged in the activity of transforming raw ingredients into food. During this time, the cook was doing something that had a beginning and a middle and an end, something that required attention and skill, something that produced a concrete result that could be evaluated and tasted and improved. This kitchen time was not empty time, not wasted time, not time subtracted from something more valuable. It was the time during which knowledge was transmitted. Children who were present in the kitchen, who helped with small tasks, who watched from the doorway, who absorbed the sequence and the judgments and the sensory vocabulary of cooking through simple proximity over years, received an education that had no curriculum, no textbook, no formal assessment. They learned by watching. They learned what goes with what, how heat transforms food, what patience means in a kitchen, what it looks and sounds and smells like when something is right. This kind of knowledge, tacit, embodied, transmitted through observation rather than instruction, is among the most durable and most practically useful kinds of knowledge that human beings possess. It is also among the most fragile in the sense that it cannot survive the interruption of its transmission. If the generation that possesses it does not pass it to the generation that follows through the channel of daily presence, it is simply gone. There is no book that adequately substitutes for watching a competent cook work over the course of many years. As the frozen meal made cooking less necessary, the kitchen time contracted. Parents who relied on prepared and frozen foods spent less time cooking, which meant less time in the kitchen, which meant fewer hours of the daily presence through which the knowledge could move from one generation to the next. This did not happen all at once, and it did not happen uniformly. Different households, different families, different relationships with food and cooking. But it happened, and its consequences accumulated over decades into something that was eventually visible in the data. The cooking knowledge deficit that nutritionists and food writers began documenting in the 1980s. The inability of a significant portion of the adult population to prepare a meal from basic ingredients without a recipe. The loss of the intuitive understanding of food that had been ordinary in every previous generation. But there was another loss alongside this, and this one is harder to quantify because it lived in the spaces between people rather than in any individual capability. The dinner table conversation, the specific quality of talk that happens when people who share a life sit down together with food in front of them and nothing else on the agenda. Not a meeting, not a performance, not a conversation with a purpose, but the kind of meandering, interrupted, often trivial exchange that is, over years, the medium through which intimate knowledge of other people is built. This knowledge, who is worried today, who is excited about what, who is growing and changing and needs a different kind of attention from the week before, cannot be acquired through any other channel at the same depth.
It requires the daily accumulation of small observations, the kind that are only possible when people share a regular, unhurried time together. The dinner table was, in most families before the television, the regular, unhurried time. It was the hour when the day was surveyed, when the family took account of itself, when children were present to adult conversation and adults were present to children's lives in a way that the rest of the day's schedule often did not allow. The television redirected this. It gave families something to look at together that was more interesting than each other, at least in the short term. And looking at the same screen is not the same as looking at each other. The conversations that happen in front of a television are not the same as conversations that happen across a table. They are shorter, less personal, more likely to comment on the screen than to address the person sitting next to you.
The quiet protest. Not everyone opened the freezer case and reached for the aluminum tray without hesitation. There were voices, some quiet, some not so quiet, some individual and some organized, that said, "Wait, something is being lost here that we should name before it is entirely gone." Julia Child appeared on American television for the first time in 1963, a decade after the TV dinner's debut. This timing, which might seem coincidental, was perhaps not entirely so. Child's program, The French Chef, broadcast on public television, reached a smaller audience than the commercial networks, but one that was paying a different kind of attention. She cooked French food, not the simplified, adapted French-American food that cookbooks had been offering since the 1940s, but real French cooking, the kind with technique and time requirements, the kind that took butter seriously, the kind that assumed a serious cook who was genuinely interested in the food rather than merely executing a recipe. She was funny, and this was the first and perhaps most important thing about her. She made cooking a pleasure rather than an obligation, which was the radical move. Cooking shows before Child had been earnest and instructional, a corrective display of proper technique, the implicit message being, if you do this correctly, you will succeed. If you fail, you have done something wrong. Child was different. She made things that didn't always work out. She explained the failure. She showed how to recover. She laughed when appropriate and moved forward when appropriate and treated the whole enterprise as something that was inherently enjoyable even when it was difficult. Her implicit argument was about value, that the time spent cooking was not subtracted from more valuable activities, but was itself valuable, that the act of making a meal was part of the pleasure of eating it, that the kitchen was a place of genuine satisfaction for anyone willing to engage with it on its own terms. This was not an argument against the TV dinner, not in any direct sense. She did not mention it, did not criticize it, did not position herself as the opponent of industrial food. But the argument she was making was the obverse of everything the TV dinner represented. Americans received this argument in large numbers. The show ran for years. Her book became one of the most widely used cookbooks in American history, not a coffee table item, but a tool, flour-dusted and stained and annotated in the margins by the people who cooked from it. The number of Americans who read Child's book and then spent a Sunday afternoon making bœuf bourguignon was not negligible. It was, by any measure, a significant cultural counterforce to the forces of convenience that were otherwise dominant. In the late 1960s and 1970s, a different kind of resistance emerged from a different direction. The counterculture's relationship with food was not simple or unified, but it included, as one of its significant threads, a critique of industrial food and the values it embodied. The organic food movement that began among small farmers and politically conscious urban consumers argued that the industrialization of food production had costs that the retail price did not reflect. Environmental costs, costs to the health of farm workers and consumers, costs to the communities whose traditional food economies had been displaced by large-scale industrial production. The TV dinner was not the primary target of this critique. That honor belonged to the petrochemical fertilizers and pesticides of industrial agriculture. But the TV dinner was a visible symptom of the system under critique, and it sometimes stood in as an example of what was wrong. Food that had been processed far from its eaters by people who had no relation to them. Food whose ingredients were unknown. Food that had been engineered for consistency and shelf life rather than for nutrition or pleasure. The Back to the Land movement, which sent thousands of young Americans to rural communes and small farms throughout the late 1960s and the decade that followed, organized itself around an explicit rejection of the values the TV dinner represented. It demanded reconnection with the labor of food production, growing and harvesting, cooking from scratch, building the knowledge of food that the industrial system had displaced. The movement had its failures and its naiveties, but it also planted seeds, sometimes literally, that grew into institutions now fully established: the natural food store, the farmer's market, the community-supported agriculture subscription, the slow food movement, the farm-to-table restaurant. All of these institutions are, in part, answers to a question that the TV dinner posed. They represent the persistence of a different way of thinking about the relationship between food and daily life, a way that insists on the value of the connection, the knowledge, the time, the presence that the TV dinner made unnecessary. The factories at night. While America watched television, while the families sat with their trays and the screens filled their living rooms with light and sound, the factories ran. This is always true of mass-produced food, and it was true of the TV dinner from the earliest days of its production. The demand was continuous. The grocery stores needed inventory, the warehouses needed stock, the freezer cases needed filling. The production never stopped. The factory at night had a specific character, different from the day in ways that anyone who has worked a night shift understands. Fewer people in the same space, the same machinery, the same conveyors, the same refrigerated air, but with less of the human density that gives the day shift its particular texture. The sounds of the night shift were cleaner, more purely mechanical. The machinery unaccompanied by the human murmur and movement that the day shift added. The fluorescent lights were the same, the cold was the same, but the space felt different. Workers on the night shift came from the full range of people who work the hours when others sleep. Some preferred nights, the relative quiet, the smaller crew, the slight sense of the world belonging to them in a way it didn't during the day. Some took night shifts because the day shift had no openings when they applied, because circumstances required the work and the night shift was what was available. There were women, increasingly through the late 1950s and 1960s, drawn into the expanding labor force that the frozen food industry needed and that the cultural permission of the post-war economy was slowly and unevenly providing. Each worker had a specific position on the line: quality control, portioning, packaging, sealing, stacking, loading. Each position required its own learned skill. The ability to perform a specific action at a specific speed with a specific level of consistency, thousands of times in a single shift, without the loss of attention that repetition always threatens. The skill was real, even when it was not recognized as such. The quality of the product, the thing that determined whether the consumer bought it again, whether the brand survived and grew or failed and shrank, depended on the quality of this work. The quality control workers stood at their stations along the line and watched the trays pass. Each tray needed to be correct, the right weight in each compartment, the right color, the right seal on the foil cover. Most trays were correct. The production system had been engineered for consistency, and consistency was what it produced, hour after hour, night after night. The quality control worker's job was not to find problems, it was to be present against the possibility of problems. The human element in a largely mechanical system, the eye that saw what the machine could not assess. The portioning machines were the heart of the line. They had been calibrated by food scientists and production engineers through extensive testing. This many grams of turkey, this weight of cornbread dressing, this number of peas, this amount of sweet potato glaze. The calibration was not arbitrary. It had been determined through the testing that revealed what produced the best result after 25 minutes in a home oven set to 425 degrees. The machines carried the accumulated knowledge of the product's development in their settings, their tolerances, their speeds. Outside the factory, in the Midwestern night, the world was wide and dark and indifferent to what was happening inside. Stars over the flat land, the highway in the distance with its moving lights that never stopped. Trucks in the loading dock, engines idling to maintain temperature, exhausting small clouds of diesel air into the cold air. The steam from the factory's refrigeration equipment rising and dispersing into the sky above. Inside, a worker whose name is lost, William perhaps, or Robert, or Mary, or any of the ordinary names of ordinary people, performed his or her portion of the process, picked up a tray and placed it on the conveyor, checked the seal on a package, stacked completed boxes on a pallet, watched the line move. Between repetitions, the mind wandered, to the children sleeping at home, to the car payment coming due, to what day it was and how many hours remained in the shift, to the ordinary concerns of ordinary life, which do not stop for night shifts or factory floors or the question of what this work means in the larger story that no one on the line was thinking about. They were feeding people they would never meet. The tray that one worker placed on a conveyor in Omaha on a Wednesday night in November of 1957 would end up in a freezer in New Jersey or Ohio or California, and 6 weeks later a family would eat it while watching a television program, and no one in that family would know anything about the person who had placed it on the conveyor, or the factory, or the night that it had been made. The chain between labor and consumption is always invisible. That invisibility is part of how industrial food works. It is the distance that allows the whole system to function at scale. The aluminum age. The aluminum tray deserves its own consideration, its own moment of attention, separated from the food it contained and examined for what it was in itself, an object, a material, a piece of industrial design that became, for a generation of Americans, one of the most familiar objects in daily life. Aluminum is the most abundant metal in the Earth's crust. It is present in some form in almost every rock ever picked up, in the clay of ordinary garden soil, in the minerals of granite and sandstone. It is everywhere, in the literal geological sense. And yet for most of human history, it was inaccessible, present but unreachable, abundant but locked in chemical combinations that no available technology could break. The extraction of aluminum from its ore requires electricity in enormous quantities. The chemical reaction that frees aluminum atoms from the bauxite mineral that contains them is driven by electrolysis, a process that demands continuous high-current electrical power and therefore could not be performed industrially until the generation of electricity at industrial scale became possible in the late 19th century. The first aluminum objects, produced in small quantities in the 1820s and 1830s when chemists first isolated the element, were valued more highly than gold. Napoleon III of France, the same Napoleon who spent a night alone inside the Great Pyramid, reserved his aluminum cutlery for honored guests and served everyone else with silver. Silver was the lesser metal. Aluminum was precious. By the 1950s, the economics of aluminum production had reversed completely. The great hydroelectric projects of the New Deal era, the dams on the Columbia River and the Tennessee River, the massive generating stations that their turbines drove had provided the cheap electricity that aluminum smelting required in such abundance that the metal's cost had fallen to a fraction of what it had been a generation before. The wartime expansion of aluminum production for military needs had built an industry of enormous capacity. When the war ended, that capacity needed new civilian markets. American consumers, living in a moment of expanding prosperity, were that market. Aluminum appeared in post-war American consumer life in dozens of forms: foil for the kitchen, pots and pans that were lighter than cast iron, furniture for the patio, window frames for the new houses, trim details on the new automobiles. In each form, it carried a cultural message. This is modern. This is scientific. This is of the present moment, not the past. Aluminum was not the material of tradition. It was the material of now, of 1952 and 1956, and the future that was arriving with such confidence. The TV dinner tray was aluminum because aluminum was technically optimal for the application. It conducted heat evenly. It was light enough to handle easily. It could be formed into the compartmented shape at high speed on industrial presses. It survived freezing and heating without losing its structural integrity. These were the reasons the engineers chose it. But aluminum was also the material of the moment, and the TV dinner was also a product of the moment, and the alignment of material and moment gave the object a rightness that went beyond its practical advantages. The tray had specific physical qualities that accumulated through repetition into a specific and reproducible experience. The weight of it coming out of the freezer, lighter than expected, aluminum lying about what it contains. The temperature of it coming out of the oven, hot in the rapid, conducting way of metal, rather than the slow, retained heat of ceramic. The sound of it being set on a table, a particular clean clatter. The surface of it under the fork, slightly yielding, the thin aluminum walls flexing fractionally when pressed. The smell of it through the first moments after removal from the oven, food, and underneath the food, something metallic and hot, the smell of the container itself. These sensory details accumulated into an experience that was specific to this object, not just to the food inside it, but to the tray itself. The tray was part of what TV dinner meant, not as a neutral container, but as a sensory participant, contributing its own specific qualities to the total experience. When the tray changed, the experience changed. When the aluminum tray gave way to plastic and cardboard in the 1980s, something that had been part of eating a TV dinner was genuinely lost, even though what remained was still hot, still convenient, still the same food in a different container. The aluminum age in American frozen food lasted approximately 30 years, from 1953 to the early 1980s. In those 30 years, the aluminum tray became so familiar that it was invisible, simply the way frozen meals came, the container that was inseparable from the product. And then the microwave changed everything, and the container could no longer be aluminum, and the thing that had been invisible became visible in its absence. People who had eaten from aluminum trays all their lives suddenly noticed the tray by not seeing it anymore. The familiar was revealed as the familiar only when it was gone. When everything changed again. Every technology eventually creates the conditions for its own replacement. The frozen meal industry that grew from Swanson's turkey problem in 1953 created, over the following 3 decades, an enormous infrastructure of production and distribution and consumer habit. Factories, cold chains, freezer cases, the 25-minute oven cycle built into the daily calendar of millions of households. An entire way of managing dinner organized around the assumption that a conventional oven was available and that 25 minutes was a reasonable waiting time. This infrastructure was also a constraint, a ceiling on how convenient the frozen meal could become within the existing technology. And into the space above that ceiling, in the early 1980s, came the microwave oven. The microwave oven had a longer history than most of its users in 1980 knew. Percy Spencer, an engineer at Raytheon, had discovered its operating principle in 1945 when he noticed that the radar magnetron he was working near had melted a chocolate bar in his pocket. He recognized immediately what this meant, conducted further experiments with other foods, and within 2 years had helped develop the first commercial microwave oven, a 6-foot-tall, several hundred-pound unit designed for institutional kitchens, priced in the thousands of dollars, requiring dedicated water cooling and substantial electrical infrastructure. It was not a kitchen appliance, it was an industrial device. The path from that first industrial unit to the countertop microwave that changed American cooking took about 20 years. The technology improved steadily. Smaller, more efficient magnetrons, better cavity design, more reliable controls. Amana, which Raytheon had acquired, introduced the first countertop unit for home use in 1967. It cost $495, several $1,000s in today's money, and it was large and limited by later standards. But it worked. It heated food from the inside using the property of water molecules to absorb microwave radiation, and it produced results in a fraction of the time that conventional cooking required. 3 minutes. The frozen meal had gone from 25 minutes to 3. The preparation time had shrunk by more than 80%. The frozen meal had nearly eliminated its own preparation. The limit was approaching zero. And in approaching zero, it was transforming what dinner meant in the American household, not just as a practical matter, but as a cultural one. When dinner takes 3 minutes, it takes the same amount of time as making a phone call. It takes less time than the average television commercial break. It has become, in its preparation, nearly instantaneous. The legacy no one planned. No one planned for this. Not Gerry Thomas, not the Swanson executives, not the food scientists or the packaging designers or the advertising people. They were solving a problem, a specific, bounded commercial problem about too much turkey, and in solving it, they set in motion a cascade of consequences that extended far beyond the boundaries of the problem they had been trying to solve. This is how most large changes happen, not through grand design, not through the deliberate imposition of a new order, but through the accumulation of small practical decisions, each one reasonable in its context, each one solving the immediate problem at hand, together adding up to a transformation that no individual decision had intended and no one had predicted. The TV dinner was one thread in a larger transformation of American eating, and it is impossible to separate it cleanly from the other threads. The fast food restaurant arrived in the same decade. McDonald's was selling 15-cent hamburgers in San Bernardino in the early 1950s, and by the end of the decade, the franchise system that would carry McDonald's across the country was already in motion. The food science industry was developing tools to engineer processed food at a level of sophistication that earlier generations had not imagined possible. Tools for extending shelf life, for controlling texture, for delivering consistent flavor regardless of the variation in raw ingredients, for manufacturing foods that behaved predictably in the manufacturing and distribution environment. The supermarket was becoming the hypermarket, expanding steadily in size and scope, moving from a comprehensive grocery store to something approaching a complete food environment. The cold chain, the system of refrigeration that kept food safe through its journey from production to consumption, was becoming more reliable, more extensive, more capable of moving more kinds of food over longer distances without quality loss. The highways were connecting the country in new ways, making national distribution of perishable goods economically feasible for the first time. These changes reinforced each other in the way that connected systems always do. Each element made the others more possible. The better cold chain made more frozen meals possible. More frozen meals created demand for better cold chains. The expanding supermarket gave frozen meals a home, and frozen meals gave the supermarket a reason to expand its freezer cases. The advertising that sold frozen meals trained consumers to see the grocery store as a source of complete meals, which made the supermarket more central to American food supply, which expanded the supermarket's power to shape what Americans ate. What emerged from these converging changes is the American food system that now exists. The system that feels natural because for most living Americans, it is the only food system they have known. The system of extraordinary abundance, more kinds of food than any previous civilization has had access to, available in any season, at prices that, adjusted for average income, are lower than food prices have been at almost any previous time in American history. The system of low engagement. Americans spend less time cooking than the citizens of almost any other developed nation, less money on food as a proportion of income than previous generations, less attention to the origins and processing of what they eat. The health consequences of this system have been substantial and are well documented. The rise of obesity, of type 2 diabetes, of cardiovascular disease, of the cluster of conditions that epidemiologists associate with the nutritional profile of heavily processed food. The causes are multiple and interact in complex ways, and the TV dinner is not a single cause. It is one element in a system of causes, one factor in a transformation that had many participants. But it is there in the story. The convenient meal that helped establish the habit of processed food. The first step on a path that led somewhere its first step had not pointed toward. And yet, the story is not a simple cautionary tale. The convenience that the TV dinner offered was genuine. The freedom it provided to tired women in 1953 was real. The democratic access it gave to a hot, complete meal, the same meal at roughly the same price, available in wealthy neighborhoods and poor ones, was not nothing. The people who ate TV dinners were not deceived or damaged in any simple way. They were fed consistently, adequately, at a price they could afford. In a country where hunger was a reality within living memory, being fed consistently and adequately was not a trivial achievement. The ledger of the TV dinner, fully accounted for, contains gains and losses in roughly equal amounts of significance. This is the honest assessment. This is the assessment that history, with its long perspective, makes possible when the short-term passions have cooled enough to see clearly.
The last Swanson factory. The Swanson Company changed hands many times after 1953, and the story of these changes is the story of the American food industry in miniature. The concentration of brands into fewer and fewer corporate owners, the rationalization of production through consolidation and scale,
The gradual separation of brand identity from manufacturing location as the efficiencies of the modern food industry made it possible to make any brand's products in any appropriately equipped facility, anywhere. Campbell Soup Company acquired Swanson in 1955, 2 years after the TV dinner's debut and before the full extent of its success was clear even to those running the Swanson Company. Campbell's saw the potential, paid for it, and integrated Swanson into a corporate structure that had the resources to develop the brand nationally, the distribution to get products into every grocery store in the country, and the management depth to run a growing product line professionally. Under Campbell's ownership, the Swanson brand grew steadily through the late 1950s and 1960s. New products, new lines, the careful extension of a successful brand into adjacent territories that the core product had opened up. The brand had achieved a kind of trust with American consumers that was difficult to build and easy to damage, and Campbell's managed it with appropriate care, never overextending, never releasing a product that significantly disappointed the expectations the brand had established. The Omaha factory continued to run. Its workers continued to report for shifts. The machinery continued to produce trays. The refrigerated trucks continued to leave the loading dock in the night and the early morning, carrying the products of the Omaha operation out into the distribution system that reached every corner of the country. The factory had become, over the years, a piece of institutional furniture, present, functioning, expected, unremarkable in the way that things that work reliably eventually become unremarkable. The workers who had been there at the beginning, who had been part of the operation in 1953 and 1954, who had made the first millions of trays in the years when the product was still finding its place in the market, retired through the 1970s and 1980s, replaced by younger generations for whom the TV dinner was not a novelty that had proven itself, but simply a product, a thing that had always existed, the reason this factory had always been here. The founding story was something you heard about at company anniversary events, printed in the employee newsletter, occasionally referenced when a journalist came to write about Swanson's history. It was interesting but not present, history rather than lived experience. The brand moved again when Campbell's sold it. Conagra acquired the Swanson brand in 1998, part of a wave of consolidation that was then reshaping the American food industry. The logic of consolidation was efficiency, shared manufacturing where possible, shared distribution, shared back-office functions. Brands could be maintained as distinct consumer identities while their manufacturing was rationalized behind the scenes, produced wherever it was most economical to produce them. The Omaha factory and the Omaha connection receded. Production was rationalized. The building that had been the physical location of the TV dinner's origin, the factory at the edge of the city where the turkey problem had been solved, where the first trays had been made, where the workers in thick coats had portioned turkey into aluminum compartments on cold nights in the winter of 1953-54, eventually stopped being part of the active production system. What became of it is the story of industrial buildings everywhere, adapted to another use, demolished to make room for something else, left to the slow claim of vacancy and weather. The brand continued. It continues still. In grocery stores across America, in the glass-fronted freezer cases, the Swanson TV dinner is still available. Still aluminum tray, still turkey and peas and cornbread dressing, still 98 cents in constant dollars if you adjust for what has happened to food prices since 1953. Changed in its details, updated in its recipe, redesigned in its packaging many times over, but still there. Still the thing that Gerry Thomas imagined. Still the answer to the turkey problem. Still, in some fundamental sense, itself.
Some things persist through everything. Most things don't. The things that do are often the things that solved a real problem and solved it well, and kept on solving it even as the world around them changed into something that barely resembled what they had been born into. The TV dinner is one of these persistent things. Whatever else it has been or done or meant, it solved a real problem. It kept on solving it. It is still solving it, on evenings across the country, in kitchens that Gerry Thomas never imagined, for families he could not have foreseen.
What the tray left behind. Walk through the frozen food section of any large American supermarket today. Go slowly, not as a shopper with a list and a destination, but as someone who has just arrived from 1953 and is seeing this for the first time. Seeing what the country that bought 10 million TV dinners in 1953 has become. It is overwhelming in a way that takes a moment to fully register. The cases run along walls and down dedicated aisles, glass-fronted, illuminated from inside, humming with the sound of compressors maintaining the temperature that keeps everything frozen solid. The glass fogs slightly when you open a door. The cold air flows out over your hands and feet. Behind the glass, organized and lit and labeled and stacked, hundreds of distinct frozen meal products in a range of categories and formats and price points and cuisines and dietary profiles that would have been impossible to imagine in 1953, and that even in 1983 or 1993 would have seemed like a wild extrapolation. The cuisines represented here span the world. American food, of course, the turkey dinners and chicken dinners and beef dinners that were the original TV dinners genre, still present, still selling, still filling a specific need in the specific way they always have. But also Italian food in its American interpretations. Lasagna, chicken parmesan, pasta with a dozen different sauces, risotto that a food scientist has figured out how to make survive freezing and reheating without turning to paste. Mexican food, enchiladas and burritos and tamales and chile verde, and a dozen variations on the theme of corn and meat and chile. Asian food in its multiple American presences, stir-fries and dumplings and Japanese curry and Korean bibimbap, and Indian butter chicken, and Vietnamese spring rolls, and Thai basil fried rice. Middle Eastern food, Ethiopian food, Mediterranean food, food that someone's grandmother made in a specific village in a specific country, and that has now been interpreted and standardized and frozen and stacked in a case in the middle of an American supermarket. Gerry Thomas, standing in a Swanson office in Omaha in 1953 with a sketch of an airplane tray, could not have foreseen this. No one could have. The extrapolation from 9 compartmented turkey dinners to this particular display would have required an imagination of a kind that the present only validates in retrospect. The freezer case also reflects, in its variety and its segmentation, the fragmentation of the American consumer market that has occurred since the homogenizing decades of the post-war period. In 1953, the Swanson TV dinner was a product designed for one consumer, the American housewife with a family. The marketing imagined her clearly, suburban, white, middle class, with a husband and children and a modern kitchen and a television and a desire to manage her household efficiently. She was real. She was millions of real women, but she was also a simplification, an averaging, a compression of a population that was always more diverse than the marketing imagined. The contemporary frozen food section does not simplify, it differentiates. Meals for one, meals for two, meals for families, organic meals, gluten-free meals, dairy-free meals, vegan meals formulated with the protein combinations that can substitute adequately for animal products in a frozen entree, low-calorie meals for weight management,
High-protein meals for people who have been told by someone somewhere that more protein is what they need. Meals designed for specific named diets: keto, paleo, Mediterranean, Whole30. The dietary philosophies that Americans adopt and revise and abandon and readopt with an enthusiasm that has no equivalent in other developed countries. Meals for toddlers in appropriate portion sizes with appropriate nutritional profiles. Meals for elderly people with specific requirements for sodium content and texture. Meals for people with particular medical conditions that affect how they metabolize certain nutrients. The frozen meal section has become, in the 70 years since its founding, a complete nutritional service industry, responding to every articulated need with a product, responding to every dietary identity with something that serves it. This is remarkable, and it is also, in a way, a portrait of a culture that has lost the common table. The common table, the meal shared from common dishes, shaped by a single cook's judgment, eaten by a family or a community whose dietary preferences were managed collectively rather than individually, assumed a kind of commonality that the contemporary frozen food section explicitly rejects. The contemporary frozen food section says, everyone is different, everyone has different needs, everyone can and should eat exactly what their individual profile requires. This is true. And it is also, in the aggregate, a description of a world in which people no longer share meals in the same way, no longer negotiate the common ground of the shared table, no longer build the small compromises and the mutual accommodations that sharing food once required and produced.
What the tray left behind. Walk through the frozen food section of any large American supermarket today. Go slowly, not as a shopper with a list and a destination, but as someone who has just arrived from 1953 and is seeing this for the first time, seeing what the country that bought 10 million TV dinners in 1953 has become. It is overwhelming in a way that takes a moment to fully register. The cases run along walls and down dedicated aisles, glass-fronted, illuminated from inside, humming with the sound of compressors maintaining the temperature that keeps everything frozen solid. The glass fogs slightly when you open a door. The cold air flows out over your hands and feet. Behind the glass, organized and lit and labeled and stacked, hundreds of distinct frozen meal products in a range of categories and formats and price points and cuisines and dietary profiles that would have been impossible to imagine in 1953, and that even in 1983 or 1993 would have seemed like a wild extrapolation. The freezer case also reflects, in its variety and its segmentation, the fragmentation of the American consumer market that has occurred since the homogenizing decades of the post-war period. In 1953, the Swanson TV dinner was a product designed for one consumer, the American housewife with a family. The marketing imagined her clearly, suburban, white, middle class, with a husband and children and a modern kitchen and a television and a desire to manage her household efficiently. She was real. She was millions of real women, but she was also a simplification, an averaging, a compression of a population that was always more diverse than the marketing imagined. The contemporary frozen food section does not simplify, it differentiates. Meals for one, meals for two, meals for families, organic meals, gluten-free meals, dairy-free meals, vegan meals formulated with the protein combinations that can substitute adequately for animal products in a frozen entree, low-calorie meals for weight management, high-protein meals for people who have been told by someone, somewhere, that more protein is what they need, meals designed for specific named diets, keto, paleo, Mediterranean, Whole30, the dietary philosophies that Americans adopt and revise and abandon and re-adopt with an enthusiasm that has no equivalent in other developed countries. Meals for toddlers in appropriate portion sizes with appropriate nutritional profiles. Meals for elderly people with specific requirements for sodium content and texture. Meals for people with particular medical conditions that affect how they metabolize certain nutrients. The frozen meal section has become, in the 70 years since its founding, a complete nutritional service industry, responding to every articulated need with a product, responding to every dietary identity with something that serves it. This is remarkable. And it is also, in a way, a portrait of a culture that has lost the common table. The common table, the meal shared from common dishes, shaped by a single cook's judgment, eaten by a family or a community whose dietary preferences were managed collectively rather than individually, assumed a kind of commonality that the contemporary frozen food section explicitly rejects. The contemporary frozen food section says, everyone is different, everyone has different needs, everyone can and should eat exactly what their individual profile requires. This is true. And it is also, in the aggregate, a description of a world in which people no longer share meals in the same way, no longer negotiate the common ground of the shared table, no longer build the small compromises and the mutual accommodations that sharing food once required and produced.